Hey everyone, today we'll continue our discussion about media and we'll really get to the heart of what it looks like to deliberately try to manipulate people using media to believe things or do things that they might not otherwise do. Now, if you've been watching this lecture series for a while, or if you're part of the class, you've probably already watched the previous video about Edward Bernay's called Engineering Consent. Now, today we're going to move that discussion forward a little bit to Noam Chomsky's idea of manufacturing consent. So let's dive in. Let's start with a reminder that the First Amendment is somewhat unique to the United States, and it's our guarantee to the freedom of speech. And I want to focus on one specific part of this to remind us why it's there, the freedom of the press. According to the Constitution and the so-called Founding Fathers, the reason for this was really to guarantee that power didn't get out of control without the general public finding out about it. So it's a very important piece of the Constitution, and yet, as we'll see, Noam Chomsky's main point is that it doesn't work the way we would have thought. We're going to talk about Chomsky's idea of manufactured consent, and you can already see from the gifts that there's a pretty powerful metaphor here that has to do with what it looks like to manufacture something. He begins with the premise that human beings always find themselves pushing back against authority and breaking the rules as soon as things get cozy. But often when you can keep human beings in a state of hunger, starvation, desperation, torture, suffering, fear, you can get them to follow the rules. To really control the masses, if you were in a position of power, you would either need to always keep them desperate, or you would need to control the way they think. Because if instead of threatening people with punishment, where they'll always misbehave anyway, you can control how they think, well, then they'll control their own behavior. Edward Bernay gave us the term engineered consent. It's intricate. It's the first take on something. It's trying to think about how individual components work together. Noam Chomsky is actually taking this to the production level and saying, what would it look like if, having engineered something, we tried to mass distribute it? So before we dive into that, I want to just start with this question to get us thinking about how we view the world and where information comes from. So of course, today it feels like in real time we have lots of sources for news. We can challenge what we read or view. We can check out different opinions from friends. But what if you want to find something out about, say, 1923? How would you do it? Well, you would probably start with Google, and then you would try to backtrack to some reputable sources. And this brings to question this idea of what is a reputable source. Because quite often we're reading things like the New York Times or different famous newspapers or periodicals from back then. And if somebody in 100 years Googled what happened on January 6th, well, it would very much matter which source for news they stumbled into. And yet, in our day and age, we don't often think about it, even though we know that if we were to search certain topics now and find the original articles in famous newspapers, we would find awful things published that were not representative of what was really going on. Of course, one of the biggest examples of this in the United States in the early 20th century is with drugs, where we had all these different stories that were circulated to basically drum up support for prohibition against chemicals that had largely been freely for sale and for the most part safe for years and sometimes decades, but that now the government needed to figure out a way to stigmatize to get people to support a war against them. Here's Chomsky's main point. The mass media's main purpose is to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sectors. This sounds conspiratorial, but as we'll see over and over today, he's not saying there's a mass conspiracy for the media to parrot the same messages as big organizations and corporations and politicians. He's saying the system's designed so it would be hard for it to work any other way. If you imagine this cup on top that's being dumped into what looks like a cone-shaped coffee filter, it's all the news, all the press releases that get sent to organizations across the globe, but only a certain amount of them actually make the press, make the publication. And he's saying that there's 5 filters that these things have to go through to make it.
What keeps the media functioning is not the audience.
They make money from their advertisers. And remember, we're talking about the elite media, so they're trying to sell a good product, a product which raises advertising rates. And ask your friends in the advertising industry, that means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what point of view would you expect to to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Now, there are many other factors that press in the same direction. If people try to enter the system who don't have that point of view, they're likely to be excluded somewhere along the way. After all, no institution is going to happily design a mechanism to self-destruct. It's not the way institutions function. So they all work to exclude or marginalize or eliminate dissenting voices or alternative perspectives and so on because they're dysfunctional. They're dysfunctional to the institution itself.
Now, again, it might at first sound like Chomsky's saying something that borders on conspiratorial, but as we'll unpack, his filters give us a way to understand that this really couldn't happen any other way, the way the system is designed. And more importantly, it gives us a way to sort of think about how might we fix this without giving up the parts of our culture or the parts of, say, capitalism that seem to be really beneficial and enjoyable to most of us. All right, so filter one, let's walk through these real quick. I know I have big quotes in front of you, but it's in lieu of having to read an entire, even larger chunk of a book that Noam and a friend wrote that I will actually link an excerpt of on both the description of the video on YouTube and if this is part of a class you're taking in the Canvas module. So filter one is the size, ownership, and profit orientations of the mass media. Noam goes back to the beginnings of what you might think of as mass media in the United States, the early 19th century, early 1800s, when press organizations were starting to take up root locally. And as you might imagine, some of the more popular press organizations were actually geared towards working class folks or people without a lot of money. And the reason for that in capitalism should seem obvious. There's always a lot more working class and poor people than there is rich people. That's how businesses work. There's a lot more business workers and people who are part of the lower wage worker part of an organization than there are business owners. In fact, often, especially back then, there was just one business owner. There would be different voices targeting different people. And think about if you're an advertiser, who do you really want to be advertising to? The wage worker who doesn't have a lot of extra money, or somebody who perhaps doesn't have any extra money to spend on your product? Or do you want to advertise to the rich business owners or the higher ups and the stock owners, the people with money to spend on stuff? So of course, right away, you can see that even though the majority of press could be written and sold to working class or poor folks, the majority of advertisement is going to be sold to press organizations that can target rich folks who can afford to buy their product. So what happened is by the 1900s, even though more newspapers were sold at the local level and aimed and targeted at working class folks, the big press organizations, which were owned by the richest people that could buy them, because there's a lot of power in press, we're actually beginning to go out and purchase smaller press organizations. And because of that, what used to be an affordable industry to get into, running a press organization, the startup cost of a new newspaper in New York City in 1851, $69,000. In 1872, the sale of the St. Louis Democrat yielded $456,000. City newspapers were selling for $6 to $18 million by the 1920s, just 50 years later. The price of press organizations that survived and were popular was way ahead of what it actually cost to build them. It suddenly became not about the cost of the presses themselves and the machinery and the paper stock and the building, but rather the popularity and the ability to reach a certain crowd. And here again, we're going to run into capitalism sort of boogering up the situation because they've got to sell products. They have to get advertisers to basically advertise with them. And here we move on to filter two, which he describes as the advertising license to business. Think about how a good press organization would be as cheap as possible and as good, as well made as possible. And if you really make a good commercial, a good TV show, or a good newspaper, and you actually can sell it for less than it costs you to make it, or even give it away for free, voila, you're going to outdo your competitors. So mixed with the notion or with the competition of what looks like local, made for regular old folks, press organizations having to also cater to big organizations that will put advertisements into their products so they can make free TV shows, free or cheap newspapers. We've also got this other competition that says you've now got to basically acquiesce to those companies to make sure that they do what you need them to do, which is to place their ad with you as opposed to a competitor. You don't want to buy from a press organization that you feel like is manipulating you by saying what you want to hear, so you'll buy a product in an ad. You want to feel like you're buying a product from an organization that is telling you good, wholesome news, whether you like it or not, and then you happen to see an ad on another page and you want to feel like you made your own free decision. And once again, the system has now become naturally built in a way that if you look at most content that is free, you will find that the majority of that content that is actually advertisements. News or TV shows or whatever will naturally want to sell it for less, which means they'll need to get more advertisers to make up for that lost cause. They still got to pay their authors and their writers and their actors. Filter 3, where does the news come from? Where do your sources come from? Now, this makes sense that once again, it's not conspiratorial, but that when something happens with Nabisco, a news organization wants to call a person at Nabisco to get the story. I mean, who knows better about something that might have happened to flour or a shipping route that had drugs slipped into a truck than somebody that works at the company? And yet we all know the company is going to hire PR people whose job it is to tell the story of what happened in a way that paints it in a positive light. And the last thing you want to do in this interaction is piss off Nabisco so that they don't place an ad with you next week if Nabisco happens to be a major contributor to the advertisement that you run between your nightly news segments. Again, this isn't conspiratorial. It's just the way you have to think about doing business to make sure that your programming doesn't get cut. Filter 4, flack and the enforcers. It's exactly what it sounds like. It can be when a bunch of people go social media bananas and start yelling at a company or boycotting a product. But it's worth remembering flack can also be purchased. So flack is that stuff that sort of pushes back. Dear editor, I can't believe you wrote that.
Indicted by a Manhattan grand jury following an investigation into hush money paid for an alleged sexual encounter with Stormy Daniels. In social media posts this weekend, Mr. Trump referred to the allegations as old and fully debunked. He also implored supporters to save America, calling on them to protest, protest, protest.
So that's one kind of flack, right? You can imagine a public figure or somebody with a lot of fans, Taylor Swift with her, boyfriends that she always talks smack about. And you can imagine some of the other routes that can be taken to quote unquote purchase flack, like Elon Musk buying Twitter. There's a lot of ways if you have money to sort of get people to stand behind a cause and push back against people that are pushing back against you. You can call your powerful friend, in this case, Lindsey Graham. All right, filter 5. This one's interesting because it's somewhat unique to the United States. Anti-communism. Now, for those of us that sort of know there's a history of the United States being kind of weirdly and grossly terrified of the specter of communism, even though it's never seemingly done a whole lot of damage here. People have lost their careers. They've been blackballed. They've at times been locked up. This is a long story in the United States. And often we forget that it's really easy to identify why. If you were going to look at what is the opposite of property ownership, of being able to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, save $1 million or borrow it from your dad, and then start a business where you get to be the one rich business owner that is on the flip side of 1,000 employees, well, it would be a real threat to you if some Yahoo comes along and says, we should do a communist system where it's unfair that some people get so much money compared to the rest, so that we should divide that up somehow and let the state have it. That's a direct threat to the people that own businesses. So it's really easy to understand why in the United States, a country largely built around the protection of private business, the neoliberalism we talked about earlier this semester, that communism has always been this way to get people fired up. And it too has made its way into the press in all sorts of ways. He also makes this connection that the elite media now, even if they don't directly own some of the smaller organizations, the system's built so that that's who the smaller news organizations shout out to. If the New York Times runs an article, well, then Channel 9 local news feels more than comfortable covering that same story. So the cycle to your left here, we've already talked our way through it, but it's worth reminding ourselves. Capitalism always says the cheapest, highest quality, best advertised product wins. Rich advertisers pay money, allowing for cheap, best products, sometimes free products that can be the best and also be free for consumers or appear to be free. The richest advertisers pick the best fit for their needs. So of course, BMW can't advertise with everybody. They want to focus on those people that can reach their audience. And that would be the people who are running content that is an anti-luxury car, for example. Consumers buy, or in the case of news or media, we watch products designed to appeal to those advertisers first, and then to us second. But we don't really think of it that way. We think our favorite show's on, or our favorite blogger released another one. And then we just tune and repeat this process until the systems, as Chomsky says, essentially sync up. And we end up with this system where major corporations, the government, and the news, which is supposed to be the check on these other systems, are almost always speaking the same language and operating in unison instead of checking one another. Now, Chomsky goes way deeper into this, and so a few of the things he points out is that with any system like this, we can expect the construction of good people and bad people. And who is a good person and who is a bad person will depend largely on what are the large desires of the people, the powers that be. So let's take a look at this and use the example of George Bush during the Gulf War and how he explained who were the good guys and who were the bad guys, even though if you listen closely, you'll notice he's describing actions and behaviors that both sides seem to be doing equally. And let's look at a few other examples.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you. That trust is well placed. The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military. In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality. Saddam Hussein has placed Iraqi troops and equipment in civilian areas, attempting to use innocent men, women, and children as shields for his own military.
You at the State Department must be as mindful as anybody how severely diplomacy failed.
Diplomacy failed on the one hand, Peter, to bring about peace. I'm sure that Secretary Baker would argue that diplomacy was successful in bringing about a coalition to try and reverse what Saddam Hussein had done. First, peacefully, if he could, Baker would argue, or by force.
Gage Grosskreutz stuck a loaded gun in your face.
Yes.
Yeah. He's never been charged for that.
He hasn't. I told him I was going to the police, and he pointed a gun at my head. And from what I remember, as time slowed down, I just remember staring down the barrel of a pistol thinking I'm about to die. And he hasn't been charged with a single crime. And what's really disturbing is that his DUI case was dropped right before my trial, so my attorneys couldn't ask him about it.
Say showed up in Kenosha armed with a rifle and allegedly opened fire on demonstrators protesting the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Authorities arrested 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse in nearby Illinois for his alleged role in Tuesday's shootings, killing Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Huber and injuring Gage Grosskreutz. Police identified Rittenhouse as the man seen in this social media video during protests that night.
So you had non-lethal, but you didn't respond.
We don't have non-lethal.
So you guys are full on ready to defend the property?
Yes, we are.
So you can see that there's different ways of describing who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. Oftentimes in mainstream media, the messages will sync up and you won't see a split like you do in some cases. But in other cases nowadays, where we have such a fracturing and an echo chambering of different political beliefs or specific religious beliefs or beliefs about society, you'll notice that sometimes the specific interests appear to be a little bit different. And then you can really spot the construction of who is a good guy and who is a bad guy, almost always based on who is behind the scenes paying money to advertise on this channel, not because it's a conspiracy, but because if you're a gun manufacturer or say a gun training organization locally, who are you going to advertise with? the news that seems to be running stories that are anti-gun, or the news that seems to be running stories about how guns can save people's lives if there's a good guy with a gun nearby. It doesn't take a conspiracy. We've built the system that way. So Chomsky walks through some different examples of this. You're welcome to read the longer article, but I promise this lecture is actually less than that. When we have a system that's set up this way to maximize propaganda in many of the ways ours is set up to do, we'll end up with what feels like I call a hot tub effect, where we have spent so much time in the hot water, it doesn't feel hot anymore. And then if you jump in the pool, it feels way colder than it otherwise would. He says that since so much of the media is catering to business owners or rich folks who they want to not only sell products to, but also sell advertising space to, and by proxy, the advertisers want the people who will buy the products that have money. Because of that natural built-in mechanism that keeps the media largely slanted to the right, it is natural to actually notice a claim that the media is slanted to the left. Because of course, if you are not in the middle, but you're actually invisibly often, because you don't want to let your audience onto the trick, if you're appealing to or acquiescing to demands of people that are almost always conservatives, big business owners who like small government and low taxes and things that are traditionally associated with the conservative party, well, then of course it will be more likely that things that some folks might not think are radical left come across or is reported as radical left. And because of that, he actually says this is a good thing, and we'll talk about why in class, but he says because of that, we're likely to have the appearance of a left-leaning slant, especially on institutions where the status quo is challenged, like college, right? That reputation might not actually hold when we look close, but the point of that reputation, he says it actually is a good thing, is that it sort of draws this line in where what might be considered the radical left is actually a pretty stable and safe line, because since we're always thinking we're farther left than we actually are, we're unlikely to go so far radically left that we're engaging in violence or extremism and something like that, because we classify our behavior as extreme way before we would ever get to that point. So again, I want to pick that back up in class and talk about that too.